This is my first time flying solo at a brown bag talk. I appreciate you guys coming out to hear some of my recent research. Can I just briefly do a little bit of audience analysis and ask, how many in here are familiar with rhetoric and composition as a discipline? Okay, a few of us. Excellent, excellent. How many of us have taken a composition course? Okay, great, me too. How many don't know or feel like maybe this is a new area for them? They're not very familiar with rhetoric and composition, writing studies. Okay, so that's good to know. This talk is going to be full of a bit of jargon, and I'm going to go really quickly through some of the literature that frames this study that I have been conducting since fall of 2015. So I'm going to try to gloss through that fairly quickly so that we'll have some time at the end for discussion and questions. Sound like a plan? All right. So just an overview of the conversation, and then I'll get into these steps a little more in detail. I'm going to be talking to you about the theory of knowledge transfer. So this is one of the broad theories that my study is based in. Also, I'll be telling you a little bit about the literature about teaching for transfer and the ecological model, which is something that I've kind of repurposed here for my purposes in this study. And then I'll be introducing sort of what I developed in relation to these three areas of literature, which is a curriculum for a first-year composition course, namely English 1020 at Wayne State University, which I teach. So I'll be telling you guys a little bit about what happened when I developed this curriculum and enacted it with students, and then did some research, some interviews over the course of several semesters to see how that curriculum worked for students. Okay, so first a little bit about the literature surrounding knowledge transfer. Knowledge transfer is not new as a concept in terms of other disciplines, so in terms of education, psychology. These areas of study have been talking about knowledge transfer for a long time, and it's only in the more recent, probably 7-ish years, that rhetoric and composition, my discipline, has been talking about knowledge transfer. So scholars from my field have defined knowledge transfer. Elizabeth Wardle calls it repurposed knowledge. Yancey Robertson and Taxick wrote a really popular book about knowledge transfer, and they talk about it as adapted or a new use for prior knowledge. So kind of similar to what Wardle is talking about. Solomon and Perkins are educational researchers, and they sort of coined the term by talking about knowledge transfer in different qualities. So they say that the highest quality of knowledge transfer is something called mindful abstraction, which is when you can repurpose knowledge from a prior context, but you are mindful and abstract about it so that you can disassemble it and reassemble that knowledge in the current context. So perhaps maybe when you reassemble the knowledge, you leave a bit behind because it's not going to work for your current context, or you're able to sort of think of your knowledge abstractly so that it can come with you the way that you need it to. So we think about education, and I don't know if any educator doesn't want their students to transfer knowledge out of their class, right? We all want to teach students so that they retain what we are telling them. And so within rhetoric and composition, Beaufort sort of starts us out of the gate talking about how can we teach writing so that that knowledge will transfer, so that students won't have the experience of like, when am I ever going to use this? I don't use this anymore, right? Oh, stab me in my teacher heart. So Beaufort says the way to teach for transfer, okay, is we've got 5 knowledge domains, and you need to hit all the knowledge domains when you explicitly teach students so that they can mindfully abstract that knowledge in these 5 specific ways. So she talks about discourse community knowledge, writing process knowledge, rhetorical knowledge, then there's subject matter knowledge, so that would be like content knowledge, and genre knowledge. So if you've taken a writing class before, or if you've tried to teach a writing class before, you'll notice that these are all very distinct areas of instruction that hit on different aspects of writing. Some of them more theoretical, like discourse community knowledge. Who am I writing for? Who's going to read this? Why would I want to present it in this particular way? Writing process knowledge is a little bit more concrete and tangible. Structure a sentence this way. Here's how you revise. So this is a pretty broad and comprehensive theory about how to teach for transfer. Now, Graf actually just takes all of Beaufort's 5 knowledge domains and condenses them together and just calls it rhetorical awareness. So she says, hey, if you just teach students to be aware of the rhetorical situation, they'll hit discourse community knowledge, they'll hit genre knowledge, they'll think about their subject matter and how to present it to the discourse community that they're writing for. Yancey, Robertson, and Taxick, in their book, Writing Across Contexts, they do one step better and say, okay, let's try it. And they create a whole curriculum called the Teaching for Transfer, TFT curriculum, where they develop all the materials. They say it's what we're going to do is we're going to make a big list of vocabulary in the class that we all share in common, like discourse community, like rhetoric, like genre. All these vocabulary terms we're going to keep using over and over throughout the class, and then we're also going to have students reflect every project. They're going to reflect on these terms and how they've used them. And then at the end of the class, they say we're going to have each student, their final project is going to be to write or compose their own theory of writing. So all right, now we've taken this class, what's your theory of writing? How are you going to take it with you? It's highly individualized, highly reflective, and as they were looking at how students transferred knowledge, they noticed that it was maybe a third super positively effective. And they noticed that some students had trouble transferring knowledge and some students had actually negative transfer, which means they transferred knowledge in unsuccessful or ineffective ways. So all of this is the background for the study that I've been working on, and there's one more key piece, which is this ecological model. So one thing that I really like about the Yancey, Robertson, and Taxick model is that it's highly individualized, but that's also one of its weaknesses. It's highly individualized, and it doesn't always help students cultivate awareness of themselves in a broader context. What's your theory of writing? And there's not a lot of handholds across contexts to form that theory of writing. So here I'm going to draw on a discipline outside of rhetoric and composition, the field of family development and human studies, human development and family studies, HDFS, which is a subfield within psychology. And Yuri Bronfenbrenner is a scholar in this field, and he developed many, many years ago what he calls the ecological model of human development. So this is a way that he is presenting to look at how a person develops, that they don't develop in a vacuum. There's these tiers you can see on this screen, that it's concentric circles, that there's the person developing, but within that first circle, it's like your immediate family, your first contacts with your teachers, your day-to-day life and who you interact with on a day-to-day basis. That forms that first circle. Then outside is your extended family, workplace, friends and neighbors, like your community outside of your daily experiences. And then outside of that is your cultural context. What country are you growing up in? What are the cultural norms where you live? What are the laws and the expectations for the broader culture? Now, this makes a lot of sense if we're thinking about doing psychological research on a child, say. And there's a famous study called the marshmallow test. Is anyone familiar with that? So the marshmallow, a couple of us, the marshmallow test really briefly is you have a child and you sit with them and you say, okay, here's one marshmallow. If you can wait 5 minutes before eating this marshmallow, I will give you 2 marshmallows. But you don't have to wait. You can eat this marshmallow right now, but then all you'll get is this one marshmallow, okay? So then the child has to decide, oh, do I want to get 2 later, or do I want to have 1 now? And it's a way that we can look at a child's ability to defer,
satisfaction.
Thank you. As you can see, I'm not a psychological researcher. So if we look at this in an ecological model, we could understand then that if a child eats the marshmallow right away, it might not always just be because the child can't defer their expectation or their satisfaction for reasons that are only internal, right? Perhaps their parents never make them wait ever, so they don't know what that feels like, and so they just eat the marshmallow. Perhaps they have other sort of familial expectations around food. Perhaps they have lots of brothers and sisters, and if you don't eat the marshmallow right away, you're not going to get a marshmallow at all. So all of these factors would go into an ecological model of human development, that we would look at a choice that a child makes in a study and connect it to their broader ecology, understanding that an individual doesn't just make choices in a vacuum. They're not just an isolated subject. So this, I think, has immense implications for how we teach students about writing. One of the scholars in my discipline, Marilyn Cooper, broached the subject when she wrote about an ecology of writing, that we write in and for and because of complex networks that we're a part of. And John Swales picks up this idea when he talks about discourse communities, and that we're always writing for a particular community that has expectations that we're either a part of or we want to become a part of. And so all of these theoretical pieces come together for me when I am teaching an English course, to try to think about my students as individuals, of course, who have cognitive processes, but those cognitive processes have not developed in a vacuum. And that my students might be a part of many discourse communities, not just the discourse community of my classroom, not just academic disciplinary discourse communities, but also home discourse communities, other miscellaneous discourse communities like clubs or online discourse communities or religious discourse communities that inform how they are learning to write and the knowledge that they already have about writing and how writing is used. So, I tried to test it. My hypothesis was, I think if I teach my students that they are individuals in a writing ecology, if I make them hip to that and I help them think about it, that they will be able to transfer knowledge from my class to other contexts and also from other contexts to my class and other classes. So those motions that I just made with the directions are really key, because I, of course, want them to take knowledge from my class to other classes, but I also want them to be able to take knowledge from their work and use it in my class, or use knowledge in my class at their mosque or their church or their gaming club or wherever. So here's what I did. I developed a curriculum And I interwove explicit instruction about writing ecologies into the syllabus language, into the assignment language, and I also developed an assignment, sort of like Yancey Robertson and Taxick's theory of writing, but this was a semester-long project that students did visually. So this project was to have them map their writing ecologies. Along with the explicit learning outcomes of English 1020 and implicit learning stumbling blocks or doorways called threshold concepts, which I'll talk about in a second, I developed this class. Now, here's an example from the syllabus. I don't always love glossaries, but I did put some key terms on my syllabus to help my students and I form some of that shared vocabulary that Yancey Robertson and Taxick were talking about. So part of that was just to be able to talk about literacy with the same definition, or discourse communities, but of course to put writing ecology there. I also had some guiding questions for the semester on the syllabus, and they all were sort of different ways to get at the same thing. So throughout the semester, I told my students we're going to be asking ourselves, how does literacy function for me in the different discourse communities that I participate in? What is a literate ecology or a writing ecology? Spoiler alert, it's all the discourse communities you participate in. And what do I already know about writing, and how does that apply to my current context? So this is getting directly at knowledge transfer. What did I bring into this class with me? Where did it come from? Where could I take knowledge from this class? So those were some of the things I put on my syllabus. Here's an example of how this explicit instruction made its way into the project descriptions. So this is just an excerpt from the first paragraph. There are multiple paragraphs in some of my assignment descriptions, which may be a design flaw, but that is a different study. Here I want to ask students to focus on one aspect, one discourse community within their writing ecology. So we're already positioning each assignment as a way to think about our writing ecology. So we're just using that explicit term to think about things that we might already do. Okay, so here's some examples of the mapping project that I talked with you guys about. The mapping project happened in 3 drafts throughout the semester, and what I'm showing you guys here is the second draft. So initially students had to create a first draft within the first couple of weeks. What do you think your writing ecology is? And then as we talked more and we theorized more and we learned more about visual learning, visual mapping, students at midterm time were tasked with drawing their writing ecology, this time knowing more about what it is. And it's very interesting to me that students came up with a lot of different visual schemas to talk about their writing ecologies. Some students went really simple with just arrows and little blobs where they just wrote text. Some students got very artistic and created whole continents and islands with the short story ocean. It's hard to see, but the island down here is the online writing island with the Twitter planes and the Facebook planes. And then up here on the larger continent, there's the home peninsula and the land of academics. So some students got very imaginative with their maps. At the end of the semester, I asked them to translate their hand-drawn ecology maps into digital formats. So this hits on some of our learning objectives to help students gain fluency with digital media, but it also helps them rethink about, now at the end of the semester, now what do you know? You know even more about your writing ecologies. So again, some students did literal maps, like this imagined floor plan about their prior knowledge and where it takes effect and why they write. Some students created beautiful trees with birds and butterflies. But all along the way, students are responding to my explicit instruction, and also, as I'm going to show you in the interviews, I was looking at implicit threshold concepts. So Linda Adler-Kasner and Elizabeth Wardle are two scholars within my field who wrote a book called Naming What We Know, wherein they set out to categorize threshold concepts for rhetoric and composition specifically. So they came out with, and they did this in collaboration with like 15 different scholars, maybe more than that. But so it was a large group of rhetoric and composition scholars working together to define and name what it is we know in rhetoric and composition, and thus hopefully help us teach it better. So what I did was I read through this book and I looked at all of the threshold concepts that they identified, and I categorized and pulled out the threshold concepts that specifically had direct parallels to our English 1020 learning outcomes. So I was not working with the 31 concepts that Wardle and Adler-Kasner pointed out. I was working with 7. So that just helped me narrow my frame and also fit really closely with the learning outcomes of the class. So my first question was, what do students bring into English 1020? How do they negotiate threshold concepts in my ecological model with knowledge that they are bringing in? So the first step was the phase 1 interviews. I had 7 students agree to participate in this long-term study. And the first step was to be interviewed by me during finals week after they had turned in their final projects. I used a directed content analysis from C and Shannon. And I coded their interviews. Each interview lasted about an hour. I transcribed them and I coded their responses to look for the 3 main things that I was interested in, which was how the students were dealing with prior knowledge that they brought into English 1020, how they had negotiated those threshold concepts within the course, and what they understood about their literate ecologies at this point, fresh out of the class. So the first thing that I noticed was that students were able to talk very fluently about their prior knowledge, but they handled it in some distinctly different ways. So first of all, students could be aware of their prior knowledge in that, oh yes, I could explicitly tell you I've done that before. Yes, in high school, I did a research paper. So when we did our research paper in English 1020, I knew what I was doing. Other students were only able to talk about using the knowledge without saying where it came from. So this I termed activated prior knowledge, so they're just acting with it. They don't know that they're acting with it. And then there were also moments where students were able to say, yeah, I don't know about that. That's absent prior knowledge, so they didn't have the baseline to work with there. Also, interestingly, in this phase 1 of the interviews, students were able to connect with all of the threshold concepts that I had connected to our learning outcomes, but 2 in particular were sky high, and the rest were just kind of low level. The 2 threshold concepts that students really took with them from an English 1020 course were the first one, writing is social and rhetorical activity. And the last one, which is writing is linked to identity, which I found very interesting, since in a writing ecology, we think about being an individual and how we as an individual relate to our ecology. More on that in a second. Since this is a longitudinal study, I picked it up the next semester. I had the same 7 students come back for interviews, again about an hour in length. And here I was looking for, okay, Do you remember anything we talked about last semester? Did the knowledge transfer? So our phase 2 interviews, those same 7 students sat down with me again for about an hour. I used directed content analysis, so it's the same coding scheme that I used the first time as I transcribed their interviews, went through a long time looking for these particular areas of prior knowledge, threshold concepts, and literary ecologies. So here's what I found. A semester later, students were less able to say, oh yes, the prior knowledge that I brought with me from English 1020 really helped. But they were much more able, 58 occurrences, were they able to talk about doing something that they had learned in English 1020, though they weren't able to say, oh yeah, I remember when we talked about that in class, but they were able to say, and I revised, and I got with my friend, because we've been doing peer review together, so they could talk about using the knowledge more than they could say, oh yes, I remember that we did that in English 1020, and now I use it today. And interestingly, the absent prior knowledge stayed the same. So pretty much, if they hadn't known something before, they still couldn't count on it. They hadn't encountered it since then. Okay, so here's something that's really interesting. I was also looking at where students were transferring knowledge. So I was looking at if they transferred from my class to contexts outside of Wayne State, if they transferred knowledge from outside Wayne State to their second semester courses, and if they just did from my class to their next semester classes. So here's what that looked like. Overwhelmingly, the majority of knowledge transferred directly from English 1020 to their next semester classes, whether they were writing classes or not. So that's exciting because students were able to take writing knowledge that they gained in 1020 and repurpose it in their psychology classes and in their sociology classes. In any class that they had that next semester where there was writing, they were able to transfer knowledge from English 1020, and I was able to document it. But perhaps maybe more exciting to me was the fact that students were able to take knowledge from English 1020 and transfer it to contexts outside Wayne State. Students were able to transfer it to their workplace, to their faith community, and even maybe more excitingly, and something that only a couple of students said explicitly, but that I got really excited about, because they knew they could, they took knowledge from outside Wayne State into their next semester. So I had a student, in one example, he was a server, and he said, hey, because I learned that this is part of my writing ecology, I thought about how I take notes as a server, and I started using that same style in my biology class, and now I can take notes really way faster. This was very exciting. This is the kind of knowledge transfer that I was hoping to see with the writing ecology model. And also interestingly, and this is the last graph I have to show you guys, and then if we have time, maybe we can have some questions. But the emphasis on the threshold concepts that students took with them stayed the same. So there was even more transfer about writing being a social and rhetorical activity. And there was even more stronger transfer that writing is connected to our identity. And there was even lower transfer in some of the other threshold concepts. One of the things that I took away from this in my analysis was the importance of explicit instruction. Because the two key threshold concepts that are most closely related to a writing ecology are our individual interaction with our collective ecology, and the fact that out of all the threshold concepts, the two that were always instructed in every project were those two. All the other threshold concepts only saw action in one project throughout the semester. So the importance of explicit instruction throughout the entire semester became key to how and why students were able to transfer this knowledge most strongly. And currently doing a follow-up study. Stay tuned. I'll be interviewing students throughout this academic year, 2 years later, from our initial class together, and hopefully have some more implications about knowledge transfer over the long term. Thank you.
Oh, questions, comments? Okay.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for talking.
Oh, you're welcome. What's your name?
My name is Gerald.
Hi, Gerald.
Pleasure. I, like most people who occasionally write, have reference books, right? That we picked up, you know, maybe a little handbook. Yes.
Love me a handbook.
When you study, you know, knowledge transfer and, you know, what students have retained, how do you figure in these materials, these like extensions of memory, you know, that they may or may not use to how they've retained material, or that they know they don't know the answer, but they know where to find it if they're writing something. They have that resource available. They don't have to remember. Like how does that figure it all into your?
You know, I didn't separate out for that, although in my interviews there were many instances. That's a great idea. I should go back and count how many instances students said, I looked at my notes from English 1020. Oh yeah, I still had my notes from your class. I looked back at the website. I would call that activation of prior knowledge, even if it's not awareness, even if you're not saying like some of those students said, oh, I had my notes from your class. That would be awareness of prior knowledge, that they know, I learned it before, I can go back and bring it forward. A student who might just use a handbook, like, oh yeah, I had this handbook and so I referenced it because I was doing citations again. That would be activation of prior knowledge. If you're just using it and not aware of it. But if you're aware of it, that would be a little bit more mindful abstraction because you're able to call back to where you learned it, where you got the knowledge from. So I didn't count all of those instances, but I did separate the kinds of knowledge transfer that I was seeing. Lisa.
So, first of all, thank you for this. It was a great presentation. I really enjoyed learning about the ecological concept. It just makes sense to me.
Right.
Especially the way our cognition, we know more and more about how cognition is social. So this absolutely makes sense. My question is about your study and the specifics of it and how you plan to expand it going forward, because this sounds very much like a kind of a small pilot. You know, it's just 7 students and you, right?
Yeah.
It would be really cool if you got more people involved, so you could make it more like a double-blind study. Because I would really want to know if students weren't being taught in this way, without the explicit knowledge, how much do they remember? And also with you interviewing them and you coding it, it just seems like they might be performing for you. You're their beloved 1020 teacher. They want to impress you. They want to. So that could throw it off a little bit too. I mean, I think the results you're getting so far are very suggestive, and I think it just begs for a bigger project.
I absolutely agree.
And I want to teach this class.
Excellent. Let's do it. Next time I'm teaching 1020. Yes, I totally agree. Those are some of the weaknesses that I talked about in my discussion for this study, for the first iteration of it. I will say that the 7 students who stayed with me, it's a longitudinal study, so That's my one big part. If I can't have a broad swath, I want to go deep with it. But those 7 students are very efficacious. And actually something that I put in my discussion is that they are all honor students. So that also qualifies this population. And I would love, my heart's desire would be to make this a cross-institutional study where I could work with colleagues at other institutions to see if the same concepts would hold with different student populations, different cultural contexts, right? As Rothenbrenner kind of gets into that wider sphere, I think that would be really interesting too.
So your man across there.
I was just, all the students volunteers, or did you personally ask them? I was just wondering, do you think the results of how the knowledge transferred would be different if they weren't honor students?
Yes, I've thought about that a lot because I think in some ways it might not be as strong in particular areas, but I think in other ways I might get more information because honor students are very focused in a way that a broader collection of students would have like maybe more diversity of experiences.
Just because when you showed the graph, the first and the very last, I don't know what, the writing is social, writing is linked to. I just feel like those are traits that you see in a lot of like really highly educated people that do really well in school, people that really try to put a lot of themselves into their work. So I was just wondering if maybe you got some kids who like didn't do as well. If you see more like more reflection is critical, I feel like you definitely see that more with kids who would be less honor students.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Questions? Isaac?
Yeah, I guess my main curiosity on the findings, what we call them, is kind of measuring the gap between the awareness of transfer and then we had between that and the application transfer, right? And that was something like 16 to 50. It was pretty big. I think it was on 33 to 60, right? So you had this pretty big gap. And I'm curious, at least, and I agree that like a bigger study would really kind of like flesh this out, and I'm sure you'd love to do that whenever given the opportunity. But you know, some of that gap has to be students who had prior knowledge coming into English 1020, right? And when they are activating that knowledge that was taught in English 1020, they're activating knowledge that they had coming in.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how much this teaching method is able to sort of help students even reach back further to things they've learned in high school, right, or outside of the classroom, and bring those forward into their later classes at Wayne that they wouldn't otherwise if they didn't have this model in their freshman class.
Yeah, I agree, because what you're talking about is exactly what I was most interested in the phase 1 interview.
Yeah.
Because here, we're talking about, it's the end of English 1020, it's December, and so any prior knowledge that we've talked about throughout the semester has been prior to my class. So that shared vocabulary that we talked about in the syllabus, the way that I contextualize it for students is exactly what you're talking about. Like, hey, so did you guys have you done this before? In high school? High school is a great common denominator, but it's not the only one. Students have had other work experiences before my class, right? So in the phase 1, prior knowledge refers to prior to English 1020. And then in the phase 2 interviews, prior knowledge refers to English 1020 knowledge.
I know, right? And that's why what I'm curious is how much of that is mapping forward from phase 1 to phase 2.
Oh,
that
yeah.
Prior knowledge, right? So that high school or work knowledge, how much of that is then looking like it's activation of prior knowledge from English 1020, when in fact it's activation of those same skill sets that are learned at the workplace or in high school,
Yeah.
right? And measuring whether or not this sort of method for English 1020 is helping pull forward English 1020 composition skills and knowledges, or if it's helping pull forward previous knowledge, which would be an equally important
Yeah.
finding, but is just a different sort of thing.
Like, are the roots only this deep, or are they deeper?
Yeah, where are you getting people to?
Where's the
migrate from?
origin? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Just a question on the mapping.
Yeah.
Now that is part of the, the whole 10-20 course, right? I mean, everybody in it does this, is that correct?
In this curriculum, so this does not reflect what we would call the common syllabus.
No.
Okay.
But in your class of what, 24, 22 or something like
I ran this across 3 sections. So,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
which is quite a few people. So, these maps are fantastic. How many maps were not so fantastic about? I mean, is this the cream of the crop, or?
No, these are just the ones I have photos of.
But I mean, everyone in your class didn't get an A.
Oh, that is true.
Or a B.
That is true.
So what did those C and D students do when asked to do? I'm just curious.
I think that's a great question, ML. And what I would say is that almost universally, the first draft of these maps were pretty rough.
Oh, these are final maps.
These are the second drafts,
Oh.
and then these are the final drafts.
Oh, gotcha.
So, almost across the board, the first time I present this assignment, students are like, what is she on? What is she asking us to do? And it's difficult, and it's the very first time I've asked them to visualize theoretical knowledge. It's like an abstract concept. It's almost like you have to do it once to get it. Like driving a car, it's like, oh yes, I know how to do it, but at one time you had to learn how to do it. And I would say too that not every student and very few students have such fluency with their, comfort with their artistic abilities as to be drawing islands and continents. Most students, once they understand the idea of visual mapping, are perfectly content to stay in the realm of like the bubble map, the mind map, something simple that relies mostly on text. And so in that sense, they're not as flashy. But for my purposes, I was interested in the choices of the text. So what are they saying that this bubble or this island represents? And so for that, I would say that as students get to the midterm, they understand, because we've done 2 projects that have focused on 2 separate discourse communities. So they've really grasped the idea of discourse communities, genres, and those midterm maps almost across the board, unless it's a student who really has not been in class or not participated in one of those projects, those midterm maps are very strong. And then by the time we're making our digital maps.
So, and the deal is we can't reach everybody, and that's just the reality of it, unfortunately. The last point with this is I hope you directed the student who did the short story Ocean into creative writing here at Wayne State. If you didn't, call them up after this talk.
We did talk about how creative it was.
Because something's going on there that needs to be explored
I
in a
agree.
good way.
Yeah, I think so too.
I mean, writer's block, I love it.
I know, right?
Yeah, it's great.
I'll send them your email.
Yeah, please. Get them out of biology quick.
Any other questions? Okay. We can be done. It's fine. Yay. Thank you all for coming out. If you want to